I'm very glad to welcome on stage Kat Bruce. She's one of the founders of Nature Metrics, which I'm sure many of you might have heard of. Please, Kat, come on stage. So good to see you in person. She will be telling us all about her journey and very interesting insights into biodiversity monitoring at scale, and also why it's important to collect not only the ecological data, but something that we've mentioned before, the voices of local communities, and integrate all that into the same narrative to ensure that tech serves both nature, but also the people that protect those landscapes. So super excited to be with you here this afternoon, Kat. And maybe just to kick off this conversation, you can tell us a bit about your journey before co-founding Nature Metrics. Why did you start that initiative, and maybe was there any aha moment for you, to bring that to life?
Sure. It's so great to be here. Thanks so much. To me, this still all just feels like a big accident. I never ever set out to be like a tech founder or to be in this world. I was a biodiversity scientist and a conservationist, and I went to do a PhD really with the aim of going to work in the Amazon on community-led conservation. And during my PhD, we started using these tools for generating data on biodiversity. So the big development that had happened was that DNA sequencing technology had gone from just being able to take one organism and get one sequence to being able to take a big mixture of thousands of organisms and get millions of sequences and enable you to really sort of get a cross-section of diversity. So we started using these tools, and I think it was a three-part aha moment, probably. Firstly, we replicated one of the other PhD students' PhDs in about 5 weeks with our data. So they were looking at restoring heathland and collecting invertebrates and insects to see which method of doing the restoration was effective. They would spend 1 month collecting, and then 11 months identifying just the beetles, the spiders, and the ants from these samples.
Wow.
We took all of their samples, blitzed them all up in a food processor, and sequenced the DNA, and had the data of everything that was in all of the samples within just a few weeks. And the amount of power that gave to be able to see the changes and to really understand sort of what's working, what's different in a fine scale way was quite astonishing. Then writing up my PhD, I realized, I read a paper, there was all of the conservation organizations in the UK had got together to sort of say something about the state of nature in the UK. And there were the big headlines about decline of nature, 60% of nature in decline. And then there was this little heading underneath that said, we actually only have quantitative trends for 5% of species in the UK. And the UK has very few species and a lot of ecologists. So that's the status in the UK. Imagine what's going on in the rest of the world. And then everyone was publishing papers and saying, these tools are going to change the world of environmental management, and then going to write their next paper. So no one was actually making it available for the people doing the environmental management. So that was really where we stepped in, and we thought, look, we need to take these tools outside of the academic research world and put them in the hands of people who are doing conservation, doing management, and are responsible for not damaging the world too much. And so we did that, and I went out and said to investors, we're going to revolutionize the scale of biodiversity monitoring in 2015. And they were like, what? What's biodiversity, and why would anyone pay to know anything about it? It's just people's hobbies. But what they were interested in was big data. And so I think the thing that I was able to tap into was saying, look, biodiversity is a classic big data problem. It's vast and noisy and complex, but there's predictable signal in it. And if you can generate the data at a very large scale, then we can use much more fit-for-purpose, sophisticated analytics to say, is it getting better or worse, et cetera. And so that's really where we are now. And it's taken longer than I expected, but thank goodness we have sort of the revolution of AI and things that's helping us do that.
Sounds like a super exciting journey, and I'm curious. You mentioned, of course, that you already managed to collect a lot of data compared to what is already out there before Nature Metrics. But why is data so important to begin with? Maybe if you can share a bit more of how big of a difference that can make.
Yeah. So. For us, the biggest thing about data is ultimately accountability. So it's making sure, if we're making claims or setting requirements for impact on nature, whether it's positive or negative impact, that those are actually backed up and we can see whether, whether goals are being achieved. Data on its own, if you just make loads of data and stick it out there, don't be surprised if it doesn't change anything. Like, data on its own does not change. In order for data to make change, it has to be communicated effectively, and it actually has to be communicated and packaged differently for different sets of stakeholders, because we all have different points of interaction with the natural world. Some of us are very close to it, some of us are further away. So for me, there's three things that data can do for us that makes it really transformative. And if you can get it doing all three things at the same time, then you're winning. So the first is actually just data for storytelling. So tell stories about what's there to inspire and to drive action. So that's often about just, what species is it? All right, which species is it that are being protected or that are being lost? What's here? What's not there? How can we use that to create great content that gets investors or anybody involved and interested and more likely to take action? The second thing is data for informing management. So it's all very well to say, we generally know often sort of what we need to do, but when it comes to actually doing it, actually doing restoration or actually doing conservation, it's really complex, and we need that feedback to understand, are the things that we're doing actually working? And if they're not actually working, in what way, and what can we do to improve them? So it's about optimizing outcomes and avoiding spending a long time and a lot of money doing things that don't work, because we can get that feedback and iterate and optimize. And then the third thing is the reporting and the accountability. So it's taking that complex data, turning it into a set of simple, easy to understand metrics that tell us, are we on track? Are we doing the right things? But crucially for me, those should be connected to the real data on the ground that's also driving our sort of direct interaction with the land. If we actually want to change things for nature, I think we're increasingly realizing it's a matter of really radical collaboration and between stakeholders who have no history of working together, very little trust, and no shared common language. Like, you're literally talking everybody from ecologists and local communities all the way through to pension funds.
Wow.
And corporates, and
very different players.
Exactly, and there's not a lot of trust, and that's stopping the money from getting to the ground, and it's stopping the action from happening. So if we get this right, the data itself can become like a common language that all of those different stakeholders can coalesce around, and it's packaged and used in different ways at different levels, but you know that it's all connected and you're working from the same information.
Wonderful. So if I understood it correctly, it's data as a storytelling tool that also is catered to the audience that it's serving, within a system of feedback loop that also improves the system. So it's not just data for the sake of data, but informing management decisions, informing decision-making. Okay, super interesting. And then if you were to say what's the biggest misconception that people have, especially when it comes to biodiversity data, what would that be?
Two sides of the same coin. So I hear pretty much equally often the argument that we don't have enough data, so we can't do anything until we've got the data.
Paralysis.
And, we've already got all the data we're ever going to need. We don't need to invest in getting any more data. Both of those things are wrong, and we have to walk quite a careful line. So I actually don't spend too much time saying we need more data, because that often is taken as an excuse not to get started. There is plenty of data out there that allows us to take the first steps to get started to do. There's a lot of no regrets, very low-hanging actions that we can start taking. But as we start, that's when we need to be generating the data, because we need to be understanding what's the outcome. Are we making a difference or not? Because ultimately, everything that we're doing, all the way through corporate supply chains, et cetera, the outcome needs to be something changing on the ground.
Of course.
And that's what we're in danger of missing out on. So we need the data all the way through cycles to be understanding, is it working? What's the outcome? Are we on track? Do we need to do something different? But don't use it as an excuse not to get started.
Wonderful. So we do need to collect more data, and we also already have a lot of data out there. We need to leverage it better and keep making the decisions based on that information that you get. maybe if you can then give me some concrete examples of actions that have been made, with the data that you've provided with Nature Metrics, that would be wonderful. And I think great for the audience as well to have some, tangible, examples.
So, gosh, lots and lots of different sorts of ones, but a lot of the actions actually come from using more sensitive tools that discover species that have been there that people have not known about. So we often do projects where, particularly when we're working in highly diverse, less well-known areas of the world, where there's surprises that come up. And people come back to us and say, there's something wrong with this data. You found this species and it's definitely not there. And we say, well, go and have a look in that place. And they come back and they go, oh my goodness, we found it. So we've had projects in, for example, mining projects where they've found the presence of endangered otters in Africa. And that's led to a whole new biodiversity action plan for that species involving the farmers in the local surrounding landscapes and everything. And we've had spaces where we've found critically endangered species of fish in areas that they weren't known about, and that's led to the creation of new key biodiversity areas and actually a review of that species conservation status with IUCN. We've had places where multiple water bodies were going to be connected up, and then you find invasive species in one of the water bodies, so then that changes the plan, and you don't connect those bodies. So there's lots of different things, and then some of it is about understanding if we're going to make a change in management, for example, in regenerative agriculture, if we're going to implement this type of management, is there a good enough evidence base that has nature positive outcomes? And so that then sort of refines the development of management policies from the outset.
Wonderful, and great examples in very diverse areas, right? From fisheries and aquaculture all the way to forests and lands. It makes it definitely a lot more tangible, I think, for all of us, how biodiversity data can actually impact what's being done on the field. Can you give a bit more of a understanding of where things are, like the state of the art, let's say, in terms of the scalability and accessibility of some of the tools, especially like tech tools that are used today to collect the data? And I'm thinking like eDNA, remote sensing, AI, like where is it right now, and what do you think is the next phase of those technologies?
Yeah, so my background is the eDNA, so the environmental DNA, so DNA sequencing. And we take DNA from water, from soil, and also from the air. It's incredibly powerful at generating huge amounts of species data, but it does rely on people going to the ground, which itself is a limitation in terms of scalability, and there are costs associated with it, and that makes it less accessible for some organizations. So when we're thinking about accessibility and scalability of these tools, I like to think about it both in terms of sort of a horizontal perspective and a vertical perspective. So when you're thinking about it from a horizontal perspective, it's like, how can we scale this up across very large landscapes, or even at a national level, and make it affordable enough to be put into the hands of the people who most need that information? And that's really about linking together these different tools, right? So everything is coming together really nicely all at the same time, which is great. So we can generate large amounts of data on the ground. We can link that to remote sensing and satellite information, and we can use AI then to fill in the gaps and be predictive. So now what we're doing a lot of when we're working in large landscapes is saying, right, initially you need to do a decent amount of sampling, but you use that to build a model that you can then use based on the remote sensing going forward with a very low level of monitoring. And that brings the cost down hugely, and it makes it applicable even in the places where you can't go to the land. The other thing is the vertical integration, which is going, right, a lot of companies, they're at a very early stage in their nature journey. They are not at the point yet where they are going to the land to take samples to know what species are there. A lot of the time, they don't even know where their sites are. So there's work to be done in between, right? So that's really about them building a pathway and a journey for businesses, starting right at the top with the scoping, with the LEAP assessments, with understanding what are your biodiversity risks, where are your high priority sites, and then from there building the tools that allow you to look at the sites without going to them, using the remote sensing, coming up with some of the habitat metrics, and then using that to plan a long-term monitoring strategy that integrates some on-the-ground monitoring where it's most important. So that's sort of, we're doing both of those things at the moment in terms of the horizontal and the vertical accessibility.
Super interesting. Becoming then more and more granular, right? As you go and seeing it more as a journey rather than like a one single point in time. Or you look at the biodiversity and make an action and take a decision. So it's more like over time, deepening the degree of and level of information that you have. Wonderful. I'm curious also about the data as a storytelling aspect, because we just mentioned like for the business how it might apply, but one element that we mentioned in the beginning, and I think the previous panel also discussed, is how to integrate local voices or diverse voices into the understanding of data and technology. Maybe if you can elaborate a bit more as well in this like dual approach of data, both the storytelling, but also where it tells the story of communities and not just.
I mean, it's a huge topic area, and I think it's something that actually just like quite recently I've really seen this convergence of approaching science and storytelling together, and that is awesome. But sometimes there's a bit of a dichotomy. The data itself and the science itself is a way of storytelling, right? And if we want to cut through to anyone, anywhere, stories is what cuts through, right? But in some places, the story needs to be a data-driven story. So part of this is saying, how do we communicate our data in a way that is relevant and informative for the stakeholder that it needs to use it? So I think that scientists are storytellers, data is story potential. But then you also need to combine that with the reality and the more emotional stories about what's happening on the ground. What does this, this is what the data shows is happening. What does that look and feel like? Like what are people experiencing? And I think that more and more over the next few years, we're going to be seeing those things coming together to influence people at all levels. So for me, I've spent a long time in science, and I'm now sort of starting to transition actually more into the storytelling side.
Oh, great. Maybe you can tell us the example then of what it is that you're now focusing on.
It all started with a rowing expedition where I got involved in this initiative, which was taking groups of crazy people, basically, who wanted to do big challenges. And this particular one was rowing non-stop around Great Britain. It's about 3,000 miles in some of the hardest, most sort of tidal waters in the world. But they wanted to give it some purpose, so they'd have these 3 boats, 6 people per boat, and they'd modified them with a group of really amazing technology partners to build in environmental data collection into the boat. So they'd put in microplastics sampling, sea surface temperature. They've got a microphone in the rudder so you can get underwater sound, both for sound pollution and also for wildlife. And then they thought, right, what we really need on here is environmental DNA. So they came to us. I used to be a rower, one way or another. They wanted a discount, and I ended up in the boat. And I've never quite been able to disentangle those things. So I ended up rowing around Britain with a crew of 5 enormous men, collecting data on the ocean and the health of the ocean, and actually, taking advantage of these crazy people to get data that would be super expensive to get at that scale, and to do it every year, right? So it is an amazing data set that's building up. But what I found when we came back was that the story we told and the narrative we had was a very negative one, because we were saying we've got to collect all of this data because of all of these terrible things that are happening in the ocean. And that is true, and we need to keep telling that story. But I knew from my work at Nature Metrics that we were working with projects right the way around the coast that were restoring and regenerating and showing that you could turn things around, and you can turn them around quite fast. And I was like, damn, those are the stories that we should have been telling. So together with some nature tech friends, we put together a new crew last year, which is a crew of all women working in nature and climate. And we did it again, partly to collect another data set, but primarily to tell the stories of what's actually happening around the coast, to give people something that you can latch onto, you can do something about, you can get involved with, you can be inspired by, because that's what actually drives people to take action. The expedition itself didn't go entirely to plan because, hey, climate change, there was like storm after storm after storm, and the prevailing wind from the southwest never came. So we didn't get all the way around by sea, but we actually ended up doing the rest by land and spending time with the communities. And the stories that we heard there were absolutely incredible. And they mostly start with some local activists and people who are deeply connected to their environment, who are dependent on it, and who are taking leadership in turning things around. And when it happens fast, and you get that feedback, which you can see through the data, and you can also see through people's experience, which shows, hey, it works, and it's benefiting everybody. So I think that telling those stories is really what I'm focusing on now.
Wonderful, and I think we all look forward to hearing some of those stories when you'll be able to share a bit more about them, and very curious, and congratulations on the new work that you're doing. Maybe to close the conversation, do you have one bold action that you recommend for especially the business leader here would take when leaving the session today?
I think that, look, biodiversity is complex. There's no getting away from that. And we shouldn't get away from that, because if we try and oversimplify things, then actually we don't have any impact. But there are tools and solutions out there. There are a lot of people who know how to make a difference for nature, engage properly, accept that there will be monitoring involved, there will be a need to report and to understand where your impacts are and what they are, and that needs to lead, if you're going to make changes at an organizational level, that has to translate into real changes on the ground. And to do that, it means working in partnership with many different sorts of organizations. But take the first step, because there are pathways now that are very easy to get started on and will take you through the journey to get more complex as you need to.
Wonderful. So please, everyone, start looking into all sources of data, biodiversity included, after leaving there today. Thank you so much, Kat, for all the great insights. Please, a warm round of applause for Kat as well, so that we can close this super exciting session. Thank you so much.
Thanks.